Hi guys, so today's video is going to be trilogies versus duologies. So I'm going to be going through what I personally feel are the pros and cons of trilogies and then the pros and cons of duologies. And then I'll be going through a bunch of different trilogies that I have completed. And then I'll see how often do I think the pros outweigh the cons. I'll be doing the same thing for the duologies. And then I'll be curious to see what you think the winner is. Do we typically think that trilogies are executed better or duologies? To try and even the playing field here, I did just stick to fantasy. That way there's no other curveballs being thrown in by the execution that might be different in other genres. I'm going to start with trilogies. I'm going to take something that is perhaps a pro in one area, but it's a double-edged sword because it could be a con, and that would be the pacing. We're very familiar with trilogies. Perhaps it's just my perception of it, but I think that trilogies are more popular than duologies, and so reader expectations are already kind of set. It lends itself very nicely to a beginning, middle, and end. You're introduced to characters, you really get to know them, the stakes, the world, everything I think is generally upped in the second book. And then you also get to know the characters even better, which makes for a great final showdown. In the last book, things get really intense, really heavy, really crazy. So the general overall arc of a trilogy can be really masterfully done. But this is also where the double-edged sword aspect comes in, because I think a lot of trilogies also suffer from the dreaded middle book syndrome. Sometimes we just don't get that middle book the way that we're hoping. It has too much on its shoulders. There's too much work to do. It has to transition you out of the first book. It's got to introduce often new stakes or even new adversaries. And then it's got to transition you into the third book. So sometimes this execution isn't necessarily done to the general reader love and enjoyment. A lot of readers end up finding the middle books to be the weakest ones. Typically, I would say the pro is that the rubric is there, the template is there for trilogies. It's just a matter of how to execute it. I think it can be very difficult to execute, but it's just got an easier setup, I think, than duologies do. Another pro is a very obvious one. Typically, if it's a trilogy, that means you have more time with the characters. And more time with the characters means chances are readers who stick with it are going to really love those characters. They're going to fall in love with them. I think 3 books is a great amount of time where you're not with them for a really long time. It's not a giant commitment, but it's just enough where you really fall in love with them. I also think that for the same reason, we get more time with the world. I think trilogies, not always, but typically, I expect a little bit more of the world and the setting to be far more present than it would be in a duology. And for fantasy fans, a lot of times, one of the things we love about fantasy is the world building, is the magic systems, and I think that typically we get more of that in trilogies just purely because we have more time. However, one of the cons that goes along with this is that it's far more of a commitment. And I would say that it's kind of a privilege in general to even be able to read, to be able to enjoy books, but then to ask somebody to commit themselves to 3 books, a lot of times in fantasy they're also chunky books, is kind of asking a lot of your time. So maybe not to most fantasy fans, especially if it's something that is a big hobby of yours, but I think a lot of times what scares people away from fantasy is that they think, oh my gosh, those books are so giant, there's just so much to them, I can't keep track. So I think that trilogies make it more daunting. Also, I think that you can have a little bit fluff making the book suffer. So in general, I would say if it's executed well, and if that pacing that I laid out earlier, that beginning, middle, end, is done really nicely, then it's never going to feel like fluff. It just feels like go, 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 we're just pushing through. But sometimes it feels like we had to stretch it a little bit because really maybe it could have been a duology, but trilogies perhaps were more what the publisher wanted, or maybe the author just felt like, well, but like this has to be in another book. But I don't want the last book to be 200 pages shorter, so I'm going to kind of put in a little bit of extra, and sometimes there are things I feel like they definitely could have been cut. There's a couple more things that I think can be cons or can be pros depending on your preference. One would be trilogies just seem to always lend themselves more to continuations. And this can be a pro if you really love the world or you really love the characters that the authors have created and you get even more time with them, then that's obviously going to be a positive for you. But if you're somebody who likes the closure, once you're done with the story, you're ready for it to be over, that could be a serious con, especially if the author changes things about the world, they change things about the characters. It could have the potential to kind of ruin your enjoyment of the original. And sometimes we just want those stories to be done sometimes. And then another thing that can be considered either pro or con would be the tone shift that seems to pop up very often in trilogies. And I think this is a result of publishing and contracts with authors. So I'm not an expert in this, but from what I understand, a lot of times if you're a debut author or in general you're just kind of newer to the game, they don't know how well your first book is going to do. So typically it's encouraged that your first book, if it had to, could stand on its own. That way, if it doesn't do exceptionally well financially, the publisher, and they don't end up signing those second and third books, at least that story can be enjoyed and it never feels like this cliffhanger that wasn't resolved. So as a result, though, I think sometimes authors perhaps close off the first books a little more than they would want to, but then the second book feels different as a result, almost feels like maybe it wasn't necessary or it was an afterthought and then it was continued on. So we get book 1 and then we have 2 and 3 that feel more like they go together. It's like this pairing over here and then almost standalone over here. And the reason I say that this could be a pro is because a lot of times when we're getting into series, because of that commitment and there's other things we want to read, sometimes it's nice to pick up a book and then it feels like it's pretty conclusive, and then later when we're ready, we can read the rest of the series. But we're not sure. We kind of want to dip our toes in first. So sometimes it can be a positive thing, but ultimately, I think that I like when it just feels like it's seamless all the way throughout. Sometimes the tone shift, I don't know, this one just goes back and forth because the tone shift at the same time can provide something fresh and make sure it doesn't feel too repetitive. So this one, I think what will be fun is to see, which we're going to jump into, how often I think the tone shift worked and was a pro, and then how often perhaps it was a con. Jumping into the examples now, I'm going to start with my favorite trilogy of all time, which would be Mistborn. This one absolutely, I think, has a tone shift in the second book. I do not want to say why, but I don't actually think it has middle book syndrome necessarily. But I do think that the second book is so different in so many ways. It's far more political than the first book. The first book is kind of a heist, we got to try to take down the bad guy type of story. And then the second one, it's a lot of maneuvering and trying to establish policies and laws and then siege tactics and things like that, which I ate up. But it's very different than the first one. So I think there's a divide among people who read Mistborn. You either really love where the book goes, where the story goes, I should say, in that second one, or you think it should have just stayed one book. So I think that this one doesn't have middle book syndrome, but I think it does have the tone shift. I do think that the more time with the characters and the world worked to this one's benefit. I think that was an absolute pro. So I personally found when I read the first one, the first time, because I have read this more than once, but when I read it the first time, I enjoyed the first book. It was that additional time with these characters that really made me fall in love with them, and I do think that the whole beginning, middle, end, every time I feel like Sanderson upped it to the point that by the end, we were talking the most intense stakes imaginable. So I think that this one executed the pros of Trilogies very well. Now it does fit the continuation thing. It lended itself to a continuation, and I think the majority of fans prefer the first trilogy, so it did hit that con. But ultimately, I don't know, I gotta say, I mean, it is my favorite, so I'm biased, of course, but I think Mistborn executes the template of a trilogy very well. Now weighing pros and cons for Shades of Magic. This one, does it have the tone shift? Yes. It once again is a book where it feels like book 1 and then it feels like books 2 and 3. I did not dislike the continuation. I actually think I enjoyed the trilogy as a whole, but I am going to say that this one hits the con a little bit because a lot of people, they don't like the second book. It's one of their least favorites, and for some people, they really didn't like the third. They liked the first one well enough, and then they just kind of feel lukewarm overall. I feel like I'm maybe an exception in that I enjoyed all of it. I absolutely think this could have been a standalone if we wanted it to be, but again, I don't know if V.E. Schwab intended for this first book to be written the way it is, or if it was a publishing thing where it was encouraged to feel like there was a heavier resolution with potential for later. This one is also getting a continuation. I actually think it hurt the original trilogy, but could be very cool in the continuation, which is that I think that V.E. Schwab in the third book may have spent perhaps a little bit too much time kind of prepping for future things. So she kind of did what sometimes is in the first books, which is the resolution but potential for more. I feel like she did that in the third book, which made the ending satisfying in other ways, but that aspect of the ending perhaps made it feel a little floaty and open and not really anchored. It didn't feel like a really fantastic ending, top-notch necessarily. Next up, we have the Cursebreaker series. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I didn't dislike the entirety of the trilogy, but I think this one could have just been one and done. So this one I think falls into kind of most of the pitfalls, if you will, of trilogies, which is I think it absolutely had middle book syndrome. I think it absolutely feels like book one and then 2 and 3 are their own thing. I think you could have stopped and you don't have to keep going. You could just treat this like a standalone, and the potential's there, but I feel like the resolution is hit so hard in this first one in so many ways that I think it could have just stayed. I mean, I say that there's definitely openings, right? It was definitely left open for the sequels, but I just think this one could have stayed as one book. As for one of the pros being you get to spend more time with the characters, I don't think this book really embraced that, because we sort of follow different characters in the second book, and then we sort of follow everyone in the third book, and I don't know. I loved the characters in the first book, and I liked the side characters as side characters. I don't know that I wanted to focus on them in the next book as much. So I don't really know that we embraced that particular positive. Also, I don't know how much I felt like the world really expanded. It sometimes felt like expanded enough for the story to keep going, but it didn't really feel like necessarily I was getting so much more of the politics, and it was like very surface level, and its potential was there to dive deeper, but as a result of making the decision to follow different characters in the second book, I feel like that's what took away from that time for world building. Next up, we have the Folk of the Air trilogy by Holly Black. The second one is my favorite. The first one left me intrigued enough to keep going, and I think it did a good job of setting up the fact that we were going to get more. And then I loved the second one because I liked all the scheming, and ultimately I was kind of disappointed with the third one, only because of the general feel of the ending, which I can't describe because I feel like even describing the feel of the ending is a spoiler. But if you liked that feel, then I think that this does a lot of the things for trilogies right. Oddly enough, I think that the second book did not suffer from middle book syndrome. I think it had that beginning, middle, end, even though I was a little underwhelmed by the ending. I still think it hit all those points fantastically. We got more time with the characters. I don't know that I would say we got as much time with the world. I think the first book actually gives you enough. It's not a super well fleshed out. You're just like, you live in the Fae world, or our characters do, and they see Fae stuff, and I wouldn't say it's world building like rules and limitations per se. It's kind of like, this is the Fae stuff, and this is how creepy this area is, and this is this weird little magic thing over here, and this is this creature, and this hairdo and this outfit, and enough of it is sprinkled in the first book and then continually sprinkled in the next that while I don't think the world was super expansive, I feel like it was enough for this particular story. Overall, even though it's not necessarily my favorite story of all time, I think it hits what trilogies do well. Next up, we have the First Law trilogy. This one's tough because I don't know necessarily if other people feel as underwhelmed by the ending as I do, but ultimately, I think the ending is pretty underwhelming. The first book, it just happens, and you're like, that's definitely not all of the story, and so you keep going because there's basically no plot in the first one. So I guess it does do its job of establishing the beginning. Middle, I thought, was fantastic. Once again, the second book is my favorite. Is there a little bit of a tone shift? Kinda, but I think I think, done very well, because there's things set up at the end of the first book that lead you to be craving those in the second, which we got, which I loved. And then the third book, I feel like the meanderingness of this series, it kind of ends up hurting it a little bit in the end. So I think it did the beginning, I think it did the middle. I'm not particularly in love with the end. It, once again, though, just like a lot of the other trilogies, sets up continuations. And I wouldn't say, though, that it takes away from the original trilogy in order to set up these continuations. I think that the continuations just are what they are. So this actually, I think, was continuations on the positive side, because it left more room for us to get to see the characters more, to get to see the world more, to get to see other places in the world more. Next up, we have the Shadow of the Fox trilogy. This one absolutely, in my opinion, has middle book syndrome. I do think, however, the middle book was necessary for the transition out of the first and the transition into the third. Did I like the ending? Yes. Did I like that first book? Yes. So it has middle book syndrome, but it also has that nice beginning, middle, end. More time with the characters. This one's tough, because it also kind of falls into that thing that Curse of the Dark and Lonely does, where you sort of focus a little bit, not on entirely different characters, but you don't focus in as much on a certain character that I loved. And as a result, I miss that absolutely in that second book. That's part of why I think that second book is a little bit weaker. However, I think it was brought home. Do I think the stakes were raised continuously? Yes, absolutely. And as far as I know, we're not coming back to this world. I think that the ending was very much the ending, which I very much enjoyed. If we did come back, I don't think we're following these same characters. So I think this one absolutely embraces the good aspects of trilogies. It has that one negative pretty hard with that middle book syndrome, but I think this one does trilogies right. Last for the trilogies, we have Shadow and Bone. So this one's interesting for me because I've read this twice through, and I never really can quite distinguish the books apart from one another. So that tone shift that can sometimes happen, there's aspects that change throughout the story, but I think it's a very cohesive change. I think that it's kind of seamless is what I'm trying to say. I think it goes very nicely. And I think new characters and new stakes are introduced very well. Does it open up new stories? Yes. But I think this one, it did it right. I think which we'll talk about Six of Crows in the duology section, but I think this story is this story. And the world, there's enough of the world introduced that you can see why we would have pockets that we might want to explore a little bit more. So I think it did the continuation aspect on the positive side. We did have more time with the characters. I do think the characters grow very significantly throughout the story. For me to decide on a winner, I'm going to be doing a point system. I'm going to give a point to trilogies for these ones. This is not a reflection of how much I love these. I'm not saying I think the same of the Folk of the Air as I do of Mistborn necessarily, but as far as how well they embrace the potential for trilogies, I think these four do a very good job. I will be very curious to see how differently all of you feel, but that means there's 4 points there. I will give 0 points to the ones that kind of fit in the middle, and then I'll take points away for the other ones. The two that are right in the middle, they neither give points nor take points away, are going to be Shades of Magic and The Blade itself. I enjoyed these enough overall. I enjoyed aspects of all the individual books enough overall that I think that it's fine as a trilogy. I don't think it would have been better cut down. I don't know that I would want it extended, but also I just don't know that they embrace the best of qualities for trilogies within their individual stories. So these ones kind of sitting in the middle. The one that takes a point away would be A Curse of Dark and Lonely. I really just think that this would have been best as a standalone or executed a little bit differently. That's my personal taste. I don't think the writing is terrible or anything, but as far as the storytelling and how it fits into what makes trilogies great, I don't know that it hit on those things for me as well as I would have liked. So we're sitting at 3 points total for trilogies. Now jumping into duologies, and then we can see head to head which one comes out as the winner. I'm going to start with the negatives for duologies. I think the biggest one is that sometimes we read a duology and we think, that probably could have just been one book. I think the downside, though, is that if you wanted to write this really beautiful, well fleshed out story within one book, but you had a lot to say, it would end up being super long. So I think in general, it's just hard to hit the right amount of time to really make people care about the characters, to really make them care about the story, without it being too limited, without it not being expanded on enough. It's just, I think it's much more difficult. You don't have as much room to work with. On top of that, sometimes the pacing can be very strange, because if you do what the trilogies sometimes do, which is make the first book feel very much ended, it has a satisfying ending, then that next one can just end up feeling like unnecessary and very random, and sometimes a cash grab. But if you leave it open for the second one, sometimes it can be so open that that first book is so heavily reliant on the second book that can be, in a bizarre way, demanding more of a reader. If you're going to jump into a duology, you think, well, there's only two, so I probably should set aside time to read both of them, because you don't want to step away for too long because there's only one more. If that makes sense, because with trilogies, it's like I was saying, sometimes you can read that first book and it can be a pro of like, well, that wrapped up, so when I'm ready, I'll jump back into it. Where duologies, which there's one in particular that definitely hits this, you get to that end and you're like, well, dang it, I need the second one now. I mean, that wasn't an ending, and then you have to keep going. Sometimes people love cliffhangers, though, so maybe you think of this as a positive, but in general, I think the pacing can just be so difficult to hit. I think it's reasonable to think maybe that should have just been a standalone. And then there's maybe it should have been a trilogy, because it feels like there's not enough time with the characters. It feels like it should have been stretched. It feels like things were cut down too much. If they can do it right, that's where we get into the positives. The first one being the obvious, it's just less of a commitment. And it's also so much more accessible for people who aren't necessarily huge into fantasy. It makes it easier for them to get into it. Maybe a standalone wouldn't have been enough. They need a little bit more to really pull them in, see the potential of fantasy. I also think that typically, while a lot of us love great world building, a lot of us are also very driven by characters, and also we appreciate themes in stories. And I find that tends to be a stronger focus in duologies. Maybe it's because we just have less time in general, so you really have to zero in. Jumping into our examples and putting these head to head, I'm going to start with a negative one, and that would be Ever the Hunted. I really enjoyed the setting. It was quite foresty and outdoors because she's a tracker. I also feel like for the story the author was telling, that we got enough of what we were hoping for in that first book. I liked the romance, I liked the relationship between the characters, I liked the characters themselves, and the world building wasn't super extensive, but it didn't need to be because that wasn't really the focus. However, the second book, I really did not think that book was necessary. The first book definitely ends, it feels like it's over, and there's this little last part that sets us up for the next one, and that is where I was talking about. If you get them too mostly conclusive within the first one, then in the second one it feels so unnecessary, and I think it did feel unnecessary. Next up, popular, we knew this was going to be here, Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. I mean, I'm biased because I like these, but also I feel like these are absolutely duologies done right. We get so much character focus. We see their trauma explored. We see how that affects how they are. We see the relationships between these characters. And because this is a continuation, which not every duology has going for it, but because it is, there is some world building aspects that maybe might be a hint lacking if you haven't read the original trilogy, but the world is there. But what I think Leigh Bardugo did really well is that it's focused in on this specific area, Ketterdam, and then we also kind of see Fjerda as well, and we get enough of those places that it blends into the story really well. We don't really need more, and so a duology, I think she had the right amount of time used for this. I've also seen a lot of people who have watched the show, they're more interested in picking up Six of Crows than they are with Grisha, and I think, once again, it's more accessible. It's also less fantastical in a way. It's kind of grittier, and it's more rooted in just human beings and what it is to be a person and to be hit by the difficulties of life. And so I think it can be very appealing for people who aren't, it's got that accessibility, like I was saying. Is the ending of the second one satisfying? Yes. Next up, we have a book that I seem to be more into this story than a lot of other people, so if you've read it, I'll be very curious to see your thoughts. That would be Spin the Dawn and its sequel, Unraveled the Dusk. I think this one very much feels like a fairy tale, and so it's very whimsical and I would say slightly meandering. It kind of worked, though, for me in the duology department, because the first book, it seems like it's going one way and then it kind of shifts into being this traveling whimsical story, and then in the end of the first book, things happen that lead us into the second, and then we kind of have to meander a little. It's a little, I don't know, I was nervous reading a part of that second book when I was starting it, but then it started to really get going. It brought it home. I can't describe, once again, the tone of the ending because I think that's a spoiler, but I got the ending that I was hoping for, and I think a duology was the right amount. I think it does the duology things well, even if the story overall isn't to a lot of people's liking. I don't think it falls into the cons. I don't think it would have been, I think it could have been kind of awkward as a standalone. I think there's more of a story to tell. It could have, maybe, if she wanted, but ultimately I think that this one is a plus for duologies. Certainly would not have been better as a trilogy. I don't think it needed to be extended, and I'm not sure how much it really needed to be cut down. Next up, we have Strange the Dreamer and Muse of Nightmares. This one, I love this story, but this could not have been any more of a let's just cut it in the middle kind of an ending. This one is one of the least satisfying cliffhangers ever. It really just stops. It just stops. So I love this story, but it definitely fell into that. However, it is so character and theme focused, really hits hard on the theme. So I think that it leans into that so much that as a duology, that is where this one shines. I think a trilogy would have been weird. I think a standalone would have been way too long. And even though that cliffhanger is really frustrating, you get introduced to some new things in the second book that when you're first introduced to them, you're like, what is this? Who are these people? Why am I here? And then once you kind of see how it all comes together, it's actually, I think, quite brilliant. And also, once again, it just hits the themes even stronger. I think that it was necessary to cut the book where it was. Maybe the author could have tried to introduce these people earlier, but I think that would have resulted in the first book feeling like so much setup. I think she did, Laini Taylor, exactly what this story needed. The next one's a little awkward because I have heard V.E. Schwab say that she intended for this to be a trilogy when she had this idea. And I don't know if she still intends for this to be a trilogy or not, but as of right now, it's a duology, and that would be Vicious and Vengeful. The first book could have been a standalone. For a long time, people thought, well, that was a standalone. Why did she keep writing? But once again, seems like that was always her intention. However, I think that she did the thing that I talked about where the first book is almost so satisfying in its ending that the next one can just feel like an add-on, which I think it did for a lot of people. It did not for me. I actually enjoyed the second one even more. I liked getting to see the other characters. I think that she did her timeline fiasco again really well because it's a fractured timeline. So I think it worked well. However, because of how much this one could just be one book and how much the second book, I mean, cool. I liked it. I liked it more, but it didn't necessarily need to happen for a lot of readers. So while I liked it, I think this one, as of right now, I think it might fall into the It doesn't necessarily embrace the positives as well as it could. Also from V.E. Schwab, she is all over the place on this list. We have This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet. I think this one could have been a standalone. If you don't know, it follows kind of like Our World, but bad actions have turned into literal monsters, and how the world would then look almost apocalyptic, zombie-like. People are trying to manage their everyday lives, and you see one side managing monsters in one way, and then you see another side managing them in a different way, and you follow the children of very powerful people who are on opposite sides, and these teenagers meet each other. One of them is a monster, and then one of them is a person, but the monster just looks like a person. So it's a fascinating setup, as are most of V.E. Schwab's stories. I think it could have been one longer, very interesting book. I think that when I got into the second one, there were just some things that I felt like were a little bit of fluff, didn't necessarily need to be there, and I think she could have hit a fast-paced, hard-hitting, interesting, fascinating story if she had just kind of made this one book. So I don't know, this one I'm mixed on because I didn't dislike the second one. I liked the ending, but I think the ending would have hit harder, I should say, if it were just one longer book. Last up for duologies, we have All the Stars and Teeth. I think this one does duologies well. I think the first book was a satisfying story. It was fun. It was very exploration-centered. It was kind of a traveling story with a fun setting. And I liked the characters. Enough happened with them that by the end, I'd say the stakes were raised again. And in the second book, I think that it could have been written as one story, but then you would have had a very major this amount of time later. So it needed to be 2 books. Tallying everything up for the things that I think make duologies shine, I think these 4 did them. So these 4 are giving us points for them. I feel bad because once again, I'm putting V.E. Schwab's books in the middle, but ultimately, while I enjoy these stories, I think that, they could have been standalones. They didn't have to be duologies. And then the one that's taking away a point would be Ever the Hunted. That one, absolutely, I think I thought that second book just wasn't really necessary. I thought the first book should have just been the only book. It's not even just that we could have condensed it. It's that I just don't know how much I thought that second book needed to be there. So this one did bring it down. I did not intend this, but that means that we are at a tie. And I think that's appropriate because I don't know. I think that the pros and cons, it just depends on the mood I'm in, depends on how the author executes the story. But what I will say out of all of this is I wish there were more duologies. There were other trilogies that I didn't put on this list. And in general, I think that people are so often wondering about good fantasy standalones. But I think duologies, I hope that moving forward we embrace them a little bit more because there's so much potential for duologies to be a nice dip your toes in, especially with fantasy. It can give you good characters. It can give you a fantastic story without the commitment that a trilogy or even other series, quartets and so on would require. So I hope they become more popular. I hope that we get to see especially more adult fantasy duologies in the future because I know there are some out there. I just haven't really read very many. But anyway, I would love to know your thoughts. I'm sure a lot of you feel very differently because that's just the case, of course, with anything. It's all subjective. So let me know how you would rank these if you've read them or just in general. Are there more pros and cons that I didn't mention that you think play a really big role? Do you find yourself gravitating more toward trilogies or duologies? What do you hope to see more of? But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day and I'll see you all later. Bye.